Hello and welcome to Flip Video 26. Today we're going to learn about the Dust Bowl and Hoovervilles. So we talked about in our last Flip video about the causes of the Great Depression, right? Well, now we're going to talk about the effects of the Great Depression. Okay, and we're going to start with farmers. All right, so farmers, to keep up with the demand that they had during the war, they ended up buying new equipment. Often they would take out loans on their property with the bank to buy the new equipment, or maybe even buy new land so that they could expand their production. Well, the problem is when the war ended, there was not as much of a need for the crops that they produced. So the way that supply and demand works, if you've got a lot of supply and not a lot of demand, you end up lowering the price. So what happened is the crop prices are falling. So farmers are not able to make those payments, okay? So a lot of them, they're starting to lose their farms because they can't make the payments on these loans that they took out. Some of them were able to stay on the farms, but remain tenant farmers. So we talked about that a little bit way back during Reconstruction, where the farmers would rent the land and farm it. They would get to keep a majority of the cost of the crops, but they would end up renting it. They wouldn't own it. But unfortunately, a lot of the farms ended up being sold. So you're starting to see the influx of the corporate farmers. So large businesses coming in to own the farms. So not as many family run, but larger businesses because they're taking on those loans. All right. And so they're coming in and the families are becoming homeless. So at the same time, we have this phenomena happen, and it's the Dust Bowl. So the Midwest and the Plains, so those states right in the middle, they suffered from drought. Okay, so drought is a long period of time where they have below average rainfall. All right, and more farmers are moving to the Plains when the Homestead Act expanded. Okay, so we talked about the Homestead Act and how they were getting free land as long as they settled on it. So the Homestead Act is still going strong. More land is being taken. So we have a lot of farmers. We have a drought. And these farmers, they're new to farming. Okay, so they don't know about crop rotation or stripping the land of its nutrients. So what's happening is intense farming on the plains plowed under all of the grasses that held the dust down. Okay, so they don't have any crop rotation to hold down that dust. So they're stripping out the soil, and now we have really dry land. All right, and so what's happening was these huge dust storms are kicking up. Grazing land also was reduced. Okay, so overgrazing is occurring. So there's a few areas that didn't have farming, they had a lot of extra cattle and livestock grazing on it, so it's taking away the grasses. Okay, and so high winds are kicking up these massive dust storms, and I'm talking these are huge. If you look at the image here, right here, you see these houses and see how much bigger and higher than the houses this dust was, and there was no avoiding it. Okay, it got into everything. You know, they didn't have masks at the time. They used, you know, some sort of fabric that they put over their mouths. And then they didn't have really well sealed buildings, and so the dust would get into the buildings. It would get into the water source, so you can't use the water. I mean, it was just everywhere and in abundance. And so the people that were there that still had their farms also tended to flee because it was such bad conditions. So this is a really good map to show you where everybody went. All right, so it's a Dust Bowl Migration. Okay, and if you look, now remember, we're learning how to read maps and what they're telling us. Okay, so if we look at the key, all right, we have a couple different colors. The orange right here is severe wind erosion. All right, so right down there through the middle. And then slight wind erosion is the yellow. Okay, so erosion is when the land is being broken down by water will do it, wind will do it. All right, it's by the climate that's kind of taking away the land. All right, and so that's what's happening out here. So then the next thing we're looking at is population movement, is these big arrows. All right, so we see where they're all going. All right, and the dots are the destinations. All right, so they're not stopping until they get out. Okay, so if you look, they go east and they go west. So eastward, you're starting to see the creation of some of these large cities. Okay, so Fargo, Minneapolis, Omaha, Kansas City, Tulsa. All right, these ended up becoming larger cities because people that were on the farms were moving to them. Okay, they were escaping to them. But then you also saw a huge push going to the West Coast. All right, and this is, you guys are watching right now, The Grapes of Wrath. And the family that we're following in The Grapes of Wrath, they end up going to California. And we're going to learn here shortly what they had to face when they went there. All right, and the purple line here is where your Dust Bowl is. All right, so what do? Dustbowl refugees were generally called Okies. As we saw in the previous slide, the Dust Bowl was really focused in Oklahoma area. Like you saw the largest portion of erosion there. So they called them Okies. They packed up and moved where they could find jobs. Okay, so 800,000 moved to the Midwest and Texas. Those are the guys that went east, okay? The ones that moved to California met with competition for jobs from the Mexican immigrants and other refugees. Okay, so if you remember, we had the Quota Act that we learned about from after World War I. Okay, so it's limiting all the immigrants except for the Mexicans, all right? Because they were moving up into a previously not as heavily occupied area, okay? So here comes all the Okies coming from the Midwest, and they're wanting to take these jobs, and the Mexicans are like, hey, we're already here. And there's also only so much work, okay? So the ones that stayed in Oklahoma were able to buy up foreclosed farms, and their operations did grow. So the ones that stuck it out, they ended up doing well, but it took a while. But 2.5 million farmers moved, causing a drastic change in the population. So the prairie states where the Dust Bowl occurred was more populated until the Dust Bowl, and then it just kind of emptied out a huge amount of people. And then if you start looking at some of these pictures here, so up here in the upper right-hand corner, it says cotton pickers. 5,000 families wanted 240,000 acres of cotton, right? So these went out everywhere, all right? Because they knew in these states on the west that these people were coming, so we're like, let's try to get them to come. We'll have cheap labor. And so they would put out these flyers. The problem is they would print a dramatic amount, just huge. And so way more people would follow these flyers than there were actually jobs. Okay, and so what happened is you start seeing this top picture here in the middle. Jobless men keep going. We can't take care of our own. All right, so we're starting to see cities closing off. All right, because the Great Depression is hitting everybody. All right, we still have this financial crisis going on. We're just adding on the Dust Bowl. Okay, so here we are. They're struggling financially. And then you've got these Okies coming in, these refugees coming in. We're like, hey, we don't have the jobs to begin with. It's kind of like during COVID, there was a concern about immigration because there wasn't a lot of jobs open anyways. All right, and then down here, you see the one of the cars that the Okies took. So what happened to the Americans affected? Okay, so the workers that were able to keep their jobs brought home paychecks. This is going back east, looking more at the causes of the Depression. Okay, so we know what's going on with the farmers. Now what's going on with the rest of the United States. Okay, so workers who kept their job brought home smaller paychecks, 30% less. Many families could not afford food, so they got their food from bread lines where charities handed out scraps of food. And we're talking scraps of food. It was not a lot, and it wasn't very good. To stay alive, families sold everything they had, furniture, jewelry, and home. And once they sold their homes or were evicted, they often ended up in what's called a Hooverville. Okay, there's makeshift shanty towns of tents and shacks built on public land or vacant lots. The largest Hooverville was in Central Park, New York. Okay, so if you look at the pictures down here, the one on the lower left, this is the Hooverville in Central Park. If you've seen pictures of Central Park today, it's this beautiful, lush landscape. And then you've got over here where you've got the Hoovervilles. Okay, it's just these massive, think of the massive homeless encampments that you are starting to see on YouTube that are coming up in California because of the crisis from COVID, right? Well, this is a very similar situation. It's kind of almost a repeat, all right? And then on the lower right-hand side, this is your food line, okay? So this isn't just a single row of people, maybe 50 people. No, this is hundreds of people every day. This is what you did. You stood in line and hoped that you could get food. So now we have the emotional toll. Okay, men who could not find work felt that they had totally let down their families. Men reacted differently to unemployment. Okay, so some worked tirelessly to find work, while others, they sunk into shame and despair, and sometimes even deserting their families. So you end up having kind of two different reactions to the joblessness. You see these men that they did everything they could to just killed themselves to try to provide for their family. But then you also have the ones that were so overwhelmed and ashamed of what had happened that they just ran away. And this caused some serious problems. So women and children are working tirelessly to make their meager funds spread, often searching for jobs sewing and washing. Okay, at this time, jobs for women still pretty limited. It's after World War I, so any of the job freedom that they had experienced from World War I, that was taken away because they had, because the men were back to take the jobs. All right, so the women were back to those really restricted jobs, and they were lucky if they could find those. All right, so children are quitting school and running away from home. So mom and dad are both working. Children have no incentive to stay in school. And so they're running away from home, and often they're trying to feed themselves. Now, the group that did the best are the African Americans. So they were the last to be hired and first to be fired, but it brought them together through faith and family. So while they struggled finding work, African Americans are used to creating the sense of community, the sense of taking care of themselves. They did it after Reconstruction. They were doing it as they were moving up into Harlem. They're creating their own communities, and they tend to look out for themselves. All right, so today many families are struggling in very similar ways that families did during the Great Depression. As you saw, families were torn apart and grieving. What can you do to bring encouragement to your family and friends, especially with the holidays approaching? I hope you enjoyed this. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.